My wife of 38 years died on a Tuesday. I remember the day of the week because the garbage trucks were running outside the hospital window when the nurse came in and told me she was gone. That's the kind of detail that sticks. Not the flowers people sent. Not the words from the chaplain. The garbage trucks on a Tuesday morning, and then nothing. Her name was Dorothy. Dottie, I called her. She had red hair when I married her, and silver hair when she left, and she was the most quietly determined woman I have ever known in my life. I didn't understand the full weight of that until long after she was buried. We had built our life in Knoxville, Tennessee, a 4-bedroom colonial on Sycamore Ridge Drive that we bought in 1989 for $187,000 and spent the better part of 3 decades making into something that actually felt like a home. I had retired from civil engineering the previous spring. Dottie had taught 4th grade for 26 years and retired 2 years before that. We were supposed to have time. We were supposed to travel. Finally take that trip to Yellowstone she'd been talking about since the 90s. Maybe spend winters somewhere warmer. We had plans. Cancer doesn't negotiate with plans. She was diagnosed in February. She was gone by October. I won't go into all of it. Some things are not for sharing. What I will say is that by the time we got to the end, she was more at peace than I was. She held my hand the last week and told me she wasn't scared. I believed her. I've never been able to decide if that made it easier or harder. The funeral was on a Friday. 240 people came to the church. Teachers she'd worked with, parents of former students, neighbors from every decade of our life together. The reception afterward went 3 hours. I stood at the door and shook hands until my arm ached. Our daughter flew in from Portland. Our son drove down from Nashville with his wife and their 2 kids. I want to be careful about how I describe what came next, because I know how it sounds, and I'm not sure I've fully made peace with it myself. But I also know what happened, and I know what I saw. My son's name is Leonard. He's 51 years old, works in commercial real estate, and has always been the kind of man who measures a room before he's finished taking off his coat. His wife, my daughter-in-law, is a woman named Priscilla. She is efficient. That's the kindest word I have for her. Everything about Priscilla is efficient. Her smile, her conversation, her affection. She arrived at my house the morning after the funeral in pressed slacks and started opening kitchen cabinets before she'd been inside 10 minutes. I told myself she was just trying to help. My daughter, whose name is June, had to fly back to Portland on Sunday. She taught nursing at a community college out there and couldn't miss more than a few days. She cried at the airport, hugged me for a long time, and made me promise to call her every week. I promised. I meant it. After she left, it was just me, Leonard, and Priscilla. The first sign was small enough that I almost missed it. The Sunday after the funeral, Leonard sat down at the kitchen table where Dottie and I had eaten breakfast together for 31 years, poured himself a cup of coffee from my percolator, and said, "Dad, have you given any thought to what you're going to do with the house?" I told him I hadn't. I'd buried my wife 4 days ago. He nodded like I'd said something reasonable, and that was the end of it. For that day. But the subject came back. It always came back. By the second week, Leonard was talking about the reality of the situation. His phrase, "not mine." The house was too large for one person. The yard was too much to maintain. The neighborhood was changing. Property values in our part of Knoxville had plateaued. He had a colleague, he said, who specialized in senior transitions, moving people from family homes into communities designed for people at my stage of life. He could make some calls. I listened. I didn't say much. When you've been married to someone for 38 years, you learn that silence is sometimes the only weapon that doesn't leave a scar. Priscilla contributed her own observations during those conversations. She mentioned, twice, that the upstairs guest room had potential. She talked about storage. She asked whether Dottie had left a will, and when I said yes, she asked whether it had been filed with the county yet. I watched her eyes when she asked that. There was nothing warm in them. I want to be clear about something. I didn't blame Leonard for the greed. Not entirely. He's a real estate man. He sees every building as an asset class. It's how his brain works. What I did blame him for, what I haven't been able to forgive, even now, is the timing. My wife had been in the ground for 11 days when my son started talking to me about liquidating my home equity. The house was paid off. That's important context. We'd made the final mortgage payment in 2017. I had a pension from the county, Social Security, and a retirement account that Dottie and I had been careful with our whole working lives. I was not in financial trouble. I was not a burden. I was a 73-year-old man who had just lost his wife and was trying to remember how to make dinner for one. Leonard didn't see it that way. Or maybe he did, and he didn't care. The moment that shifted something permanently in me happened on a Wednesday evening, about 3 weeks after Dottie's funeral. I had gone to bed early. I'd been doing that because the days felt too long and sleep was the only place I wasn't aware of the quiet. I came downstairs around 10 o'clock for a glass of water and found Priscilla sitting at Dottie's writing desk in the study, with the desk drawers open. She didn't hear me on the stairs. I stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her. She was going through a file of papers. Household documents, I realized, from the bottom drawer where Dottie kept insurance policies, the deed to the house, things like that. When she finally looked up and saw me, she didn't flinch. She said, "Oh, I was just organizing. I thought it might help." I said, "That's my wife's desk. Those are my documents." She said, "Of course, I'll leave them just as they were." She smiled. That efficient smile. And she went upstairs. I stood in the study for a long time after that. I looked at the framed photo on the corner of the desk. Dottie and me at our daughter's college graduation, 2001, both of us younger and squinting into the sun. I picked up the papers Priscilla had been handling and straightened them and put them back. And then I sat down in Dottie's chair and I thought about what my wife would have done. Dottie was always the strategic one. I was the one who reacted. She was the one who planned. It was thinking that thought that made me remember what she had told me, almost offhandedly, about 8 months before she died. We'd been sitting on the back porch on a summer evening. She was still strong enough then to sit outside, and she said, "I've been taking care of something for us. I don't want you to worry, but I want you to know that I've been thinking ahead." I asked her what she meant. She said, "Just trust me. When the time comes, Ted will explain everything." Ted Calloway was our attorney. He'd done our estate planning, our wills, handled the closing when we bought the Sycamore Ridge house. He was a small, precise man with rimless glasses who had gone to law school with my old colleague from the county engineer's office. I trusted him completely. I just never understood what Dottie meant this evening on the porch, and by the time I thought to ask again, she was too sick for that kind of conversation. I called Ted's office the next morning. He asked me to come in Thursday afternoon. He said there were things he needed to walk me through. I didn't tell Leonard. I told him I had a doctor's appointment. Ted's office was on Gay Street in downtown Knoxville, second floor of a building that had been a bank in the 1940s and still had the original marble floors. I sat across from him at his mahogany desk, and he set a folder in front of me and folded his hands on top of it. He said, "Dorothy came to me 14 months ago. Before the diagnosis, she'd had some tests that worried her, and she wanted to be prepared. She was very specific about what she wanted." He opened the folder. What Dorothy had done, quietly and without telling me because she knew I would have made it into a conversation rather than letting her just handle it, was establish a living trust. She had placed our entire estate into it, the house, the retirement accounts, everything. The trust named me as sole beneficiary and gave me full control immediately upon her death. It also contained a specific instruction. in her own handwriting, that she had insisted Ted include verbatim. It said, "I know my husband. Give him time to breathe before any of this becomes real to him. But when he's ready, make sure he knows about the cabin." I looked up from the page. Ted said Dorothy purchased a property in Brevard, North Carolina, in the spring of last year. She paid cash. She used the proceeds from selling the bonds her mother left her. You may not have known about those. I didn't know about those. The property was 11 acres in Transylvania County in the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 40 minutes from Asheville. There was a stone cabin on it, built in the 1950s, recently renovated. A creek ran along the back of the property. There were 3 mountain laurel trees in the yard that Dorothy had apparently seen during a visit and specifically mentioned to the realtor as the reason she wanted that particular parcel. The purchase price had been $340,000. In the 14 months since she'd bought it, the property had appreciated. Ted showed me a current assessment. It was worth closer to $410,000 now. I sat in that leather chair in Ted's office, and I could not speak for a full 2 minutes. She had done this. She had seen what was coming, not just her own death, but what might happen after. She knew Leonard. She loved him. She always loved him. But she knew him. She'd bought me a way out before I even knew I would need one. I drove home through downtown Knoxville, and I did not cry until I was in the garage with the door closed. Then I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I washed my face and went inside. Leonard and Priscilla were at the kitchen table. They had, I noticed, a legal pad between them with some numbers written on it. I made myself a cup of tea and said good evening and went to bed. Over the following 2 weeks, I did something I had not done in my entire married life. I made decisions by myself, quietly, without discussing them with anyone. I called Ted every other day. I spoke with a property manager in Brevard who had been handling the cabin. Dorothy had apparently arranged for minor upkeep. And I drove up one Saturday without telling Leonard where I was going. Brevard in November is something I don't have adequate language for. The mountains were bare-treed and blue-gray in the morning mist, and the drive up into Transylvania County took me through small towns with hardware stores and diners that looked like they'd been there since Eisenhower was president. The cabin was at the end of a gravel road, stone exterior, green metal roof, covered porch facing the creek. 3 mountain laurel trees in the side yard, exactly where she'd said. I sat on that porch for 2 hours. Just sat. I hadn't been still like that, really still, since before Dottie got sick. There was a neighbor, a man named Earl, who ran a small woodworking shop about a quarter-mile down the road. He'd been the one the property manager called for odd jobs, replacing a window screen, checking the pipes before winter. He came over while I was sitting on the porch, introduced himself, offered me a cup of coffee from his thermos. We sat together and talked for about an hour. He'd lived in Brevard his whole life. He knew the mountain. He talked about it the way people talk about a member of their family. I liked him immediately. By the time I drove back to Knoxville that evening, I had made up my mind. I called June that night and told her everything. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Mom knew exactly what she was doing. She was crying, but the good kind, the kind that comes from being surprised by love." June asked me when I was going to tell Leonard. I told her I wasn't. Not yet. I want to explain that decision because I know how it looks. I'm not a man who enjoys secrets or games, but I had watched my son spend the better part of a month treating his father's grief as a real estate opportunity, and I had watched my daughter-in-law go through my wife's papers in the middle of the night, and I had made a decision about what I owed them in terms of consultation. The answer was nothing. In the last week of November, I hired 2 men from a local moving company. Not anyone Leonard would know, and I began moving. Not everything. I wasn't running. I was being careful. My books went first, then the kitchen things I used daily, then the photographs. The furniture at Sycamore Ridge was staying for now. I was renting the cabin from the trust at below market rate, which Ted confirmed was perfectly legal and sound, and I would deal with the Knoxville house in due course on my own timeline with my own realtor. On the 1st of December, I loaded my car, set the Knoxville house alarm, and drove east on I-40 toward the mountains. Leonard called that afternoon. He said he'd been thinking about the house and he wanted to bring his colleague over on Saturday to do a walkthrough and give us a sense of what we were working with. I was sitting on the cabin porch with a cup of coffee and the wood smoke smell coming off the hills. I said, "I appreciate that, but I've made some decisions and I won't be needing any help." There was a pause. He said, "What decisions?" "Dad, I think we need to talk about this properly, as a family. Where are you?" I told him I was in Brevard. I told him about the cabin. I told him his mother had bought it, paid cash, and left it to me in a trust that he had no part of. I told him I was fine, that I had spoken to Ted, that everything was in order, and that when I was ready to make decisions about the Knoxville house, I would handle them myself. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, "She never mentioned any cabin." I said, "No, she didn't." He asked if he could come visit. I said maybe in the spring when I'd had some time to settle. I said it politely. I meant it. After I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a while and looked at the creek. It was cold and clear, and it moved over the rocks with a sound like nothing I can accurately describe, only that it was the right sound for that place and that moment. I thought about Dottie, but thought about 38 years and how they get compressed at the end into a handful of images that keep coming back. The red hair, the smell of her classroom when I used to pick her up in the early years, the way she laughed at things that genuinely struck her as funny, which was usually something I hadn't intended to be funny at all. I thought about the summer evening on the back porch and what she had said. "I've been taking care of something for us." She had been taking care of me. All along, even when she was the sick one, she had been taking care of me. About a week into December, I invited Earl over for dinner. He brought a bottle of local apple wine and a jar of something his wife had put up. Chow chow, a relish I hadn't had since my own mother made it. We sat at the kitchen table and talked until almost 10 o'clock. He told me about growing up in these mountains, about his grandfather who'd lobbed the ridge above us before the National Forest took it. I told him about civil engineering, about the 30 years of bridges and roads I'd spent my career calculating the tolerances for. At the end of the evening, I thanked him for the company. I meant it more than I had the ability to say. He came back that weekend with his wife, a woman named Shirley who had the same quality Dottie had. That kind of stillness that doesn't come from being quiet, but from having figured out something important about life. She brought a pie. I started going to a small church in town on Sundays, not for any dramatic reason, just because the silence in the cabin in the mornings had begun to feel like company, and I wanted something to do with that feeling. The congregation was small, mostly older people, the kind of church where people actually know each other's names. December passed. January came in cold and sharp and clear, the mountain white at the top and the creek half frozen along the edges. I called June every week, as promised. She was already talking about coming out in the spring, bringing her husband. I told her the porch was waiting. Leonard called twice in January. The first call was still a little stiff. The second was better. He asked about the cabin, actually asked, wanted to know what it looked like. I told him about the stone exterior and the green roof and the creek. I told him about the mountain laurels. He was quiet when I mentioned those. He knows his mother loved flowering trees. I'm not ready to say we're fully repaired. I'm not sure I'm fully anything yet. But I'm not carrying the bitterness the way I was in November. Part of that is the mountain, part of it is time. Most of it is time. Most of it, honestly, is just that I can feel her here. She picked this place. She drove out here, or someone drove her. She would have been in treatment by then, and she walked this land and stood under these laurel trees and decided, this is where he'll be okay. That's who she was. I don't own much here that wasn't already mine. The same books, the same coffee percolator that's been making the same sound every morning since 1997. But I wake up and I hear the creek and I see the ridge, and there's a clarity to it that Knoxville, as much as I loved it, never had. Some mornings I sit on the porch with my coffee before it's fully light, and I think about what the next chapter looks like. Not the loneliness. I've made peace with that being part of it. But the actual days, the coffee, Earl coming by, the church on Sundays, maybe in the spring, getting a small vegetable garden going on the south side of the property, where the light is good. Dottie always said I was better in a garden than I ever gave myself credit for. She was right about most things. I don't know what Leonard expected to find when he started making his calculations that first week after the funeral. I don't know if he ever thought about the fact that I was a person in there somewhere, not just a financial situation to be resolved. I hope someday he comes to sit on this porch and understands what his mother built here. Not the property, the escape hatch. The quiet way she made sure I would land somewhere soft. I owe her that much to land soft. I owe her that much to land soft. And so I'm here. The creek is running. The mountain is doing what mountains do, which is be large and patient and completely indifferent to the small human dramas occurring at their feet. I've got coffee, and I've got time, and I've got 11 acres that a woman I loved bought for me with money I didn't know she had, because she knew me well enough to know I was going to need somewhere to be. That's the whole of it, really. That's all there is to say. I've thought a lot about what Leonard expected to happen. I think he walked into that house on Sycamore Ridge the week after his mother's funeral with a picture already in his head, one where I was overwhelmed, grateful for guidance, ready to let someone younger and sharper take the wheel. And I understand that picture. I was 73 years old, and I had just lost my wife. On paper, I looked like a man who needed managing. What he didn't account for was Dorothy. That's the part that stays with me. Not the cabin, not the $510,000, not the fact that I was sitting on a porch in the Blue Ridge Mountains while he was standing in an empty house in Knoxville making calls to a colleague who specializes in senior transitions. What stays with me is that she saw all of it coming and she did something about it, quietly, without drama, without making me feel like I needed to be protected. She just handled it. That's who she was for 38 years, and it's who she was at the end. There's something in that worth sitting with. The people who love us well don't always love us loudly. Sometimes the deepest care looks like a folder of documents in a lawyer's office, or a property deed with your name on it, or a woman who drives 40 minutes into the mountains while she's still well enough to walk the land and stands under 3 flowering laurel trees and thinks, he'll need this. I didn't do anything to earn what she left me. I didn't outmaneuver Leonard or outwit Priscilla. I just stayed honest about who I was and trusted the person who knew me best, and she had already done the rest. But here's what I think about Leonard. What he lost wasn't an inheritance. There was nothing to inherit in the first place, and he knew that. What he lost was the chance to be a son to his father during the hardest season of his father's life. He spent those weeks running numbers on a legal pad when he could have been sitting at the kitchen table asking me what I needed. That's not a small thing to lose. That's the kind of thing you can't go back and recalculate. The choices we make when someone is grieving tell the truth about us in a way that comfortable times never do. Priscilla going through those desk drawers at 10 o'clock at night. I'll never unknow that. Not because I'm bitter, but because it was clarifying. It showed me exactly what I was dealing with, and it freed me from any obligation I felt to delay my own life while waiting for their approval. That's the piece I'd want anyone to take from this if they're in something similar. You don't owe the people who are circling you a seat at the table. You don't have to explain your decisions to people who weren't asking about your well-being to begin with. There is nothing selfish about protecting your own peace when you're the only one in the room who seems interested in it. Earl came by again last week with a splitting maul he thought I could use for the woodpile. We talked for an hour on the porch. He didn't ask me anything about my finances or my property value or my plans. He just showed up and talked about the mountain. Dorothy would have liked him. I think she probably knew I'd find someone like him up here. I think she knew a lot of things I'm still catching up to. And I think the most honest thing I can say, looking back at all of it, is that a life lived with integrity, with real care for the people you love, doesn't disappear when you do. It keeps working. It keeps protecting. It shows up in a cabin at the end of a gravel road in November, when the person you left it for finally comes to sit on the porch and realizes they're going to be okay.